to pass that moonshine. Enjoy yourself. Save some for the cats.
Save some for everybody.
Around the Earth. 2.5 hours later, another rocket burn will send the spacecraft on its way to the moon. And at 2:20 a.m. Monday, July 21st, a date which will live in history as long as man is on this planet and on the other planet. 38-year-old civilian Neil Armstrong, human beings.
Yeah, man.
My mistress body is strong. I see them welcoming you. I see them welcoming you, Mata. I see them feasting with you. And when they ask you, Mata, tell them you're Mata, mother of the exiles. Tell them we are all coming. Do not impose Christianity on them, Mata. Do not impose the nation states on them.
She's disappeared! She's gone!
To the moon! Let us rejoice! My little space girl has gone to the moon!
Roger, the EVA is progressing beautifully. They're setting up the flag now. I guess you're about the only person around that doesn't have TV coverage of the scene.
That's all right, I don't mind a bit.
They've got the flag up now, and you can see the stars and stripes on the lunar
Flag
surface.
up now, and you can see the stars. Are you getting a TV picture now, Houston?
Okay, I think we can get going with the second part, and this is to give you a bit more context about the film and how it has informed the exhibition, but also how we're going to use this film to start thinking about a new space treaty. The film has won quite a lot of prizes, and Bodoma is actually now turning it into a long film as well. And I think it's a really amazing film in terms of a lot of the things that we're going to unpack further. Two really strong narratives in the film that Bodoma really wants to get across. First of all, she's been quite nomadic herself, Bodoma. She's born in Ghana but has lived in different parts of the world. And being Ghanaian, and she's kind of reflecting how often she feels out of space herself by traveling around as a Ghanaian woman. And the message in the film is that a lot of people in a diaspora, and I think, well, given the time we're currently in, what's happening in Ukraine, it's really something to reflect about how we sometimes are forced to be nomadic and maybe really have difficulties to find a new space and to belong. And she really portrays in the film how for people who really struggle to find a new home, that maybe outer space can become that habitat, that environment where you can create a new home. So that's a really very important part of the film. And the second really incredibly powerful message is that space travel is not something that is just done through technology, through our space agencies or nationally sponsored space agencies, but that actually we can all travel. And if we think about indigenous people's cultures, they travel every day to space. They have conversations, they go to the moon, they speak to the spirits. So space travel is something that is not just done through these technical means. And there is another really important message, but we will do that. It's not showing. Okay, I'll just keep cracking on. So on this slide, what you should supposed to see is giving you a bit of the historical context of how space law came into being, and I'm going to be really very brief about it. But a really important main treaty to regulate how we're going to govern space travel was negotiated, thanks Matt, what would we do without you, was negotiated in the 60s, and a really important moment when with the United Nations, and this is in the midst of the Cold War, that there was a decision like we really need to have a treaty in place that we do not take the Cold War into outer space, was the successful launch of Sputnik. So obviously the Soviet Union, the United States, fighting it out on every kind of technological battle, who's going to be the first launching a satellite, who's going to be the first to go to the moon. And what was really remarkable that in this really very tense time, which sounds really weird to say in the past, given our current predicament, but anyway, a very tense time between the US and the Soviet Union, that we do have a space treaty, outer space treaty, that was actually quite utopian in a sense of this idea that space should belong to everyone, and that we cannot enclose space, that it should not become, you know, the territory of the Soviet Union or the United States. So this idea that actually states, national states, could not extend their jurisdiction or their sovereignty into outer space is a really important part of that space treaty. And it was Sputnik, when that was successfully launched, that the US really got into a panic because, well, first of all, the Soviet Union was, but there was also a kind of hysterical reaction from the US. This idea was this satellite hovering above the territory of the United States, and really seeing it as like the panopticon, the kind of spy in the sky, really provoked this idea of a treaty that we do not have any kind of national sovereignty extending vertically into space. That space should also be something that is there for peaceful purposes, no military extravaganza in outer space, and that actually it should be something that belongs to everyone. But as you can see, I think this picture is a really very, on the left, is a really telling picture. Space law, like a lot of law, is being often, during that time in the 60s, something being negotiated. We only see white men. Space travel also being very, you know, the sort of very masculine trope, the white astronauts or the cosmonauts, really very important tropes that were framing space travel. And this is what Bodomo, I'm trying to go to the next slide, but I'm struggling again. So this is something that Bodomo is exploring further in her film as well, that we need to think about, what kind of magic are you doing? Just, okay, magic fingers. Bodomo is really challenging in her film this idea that space was something that was exclusively for a very Eurocentric, American-centric culture. And what is a really beautiful story that was emerging in the 60s as well was, whilst we were negotiating for a new space treaty, this was also the time that African countries were fighting for their independence. And it's something, often these two really important moments in history, they've not always been told one through the other, and kind of really kept separate. And it is a story actually that we need to approach from both sides, and really start to see the entanglements of what was happening with decolonization and space travel. And also the African American community in the US, they're also very vocal how NASA and the Apollo space program really being portrayed as, you know, this was the future, all the money that went into the technology, and really presenting the astronauts and the whole program as something that was sort of sacrosanct and so important, whilst a lot of the African American community were really still, this is coinciding with the civil rights movement, really having to fight hard to get equal rights in the United States. And what was really absolutely fascinating was that in Zambia, who was becoming independent, a school teacher with the name Noklozo, he decided for Zambia to become a really proper independent country, we actually need to have our own space program as well. That's the only way how we can become absolutely a decolonial, independent country. And he decided that he was going to start his own space program. He actually also wrote a letter to the UN, and I think the American president, I'm not sure if he also wrote to the Soviet Union, but he was asking for money to fund his space program. And he started a space cadet school just outside Lusaka, the capital of Zambia. And very visionary, he had the idea that he was going to send not the first man on the moon, but the first woman to the moon, and not with a dog, but with the cats we saw in the film. And it's this story of Nocloso that has informed a lot of the really interesting new narratives and new histories that are being told by artists like Bodomo, but also Jackie Njeri, the Kenyan artist whose work is here in the exhibition and who will join us later on Zoom. This idea that space travel, technological advancements are kind of going into new frontiers is not something that we need to tell through one particular lens, and that there is other histories, other narratives which are really very important, and that we need to engage with, and that we actually, if we want to make changes and if we want to prevent space becoming the next kind of extension of our capitalist accumulation, our imperialism, that we would start mining in outer space and doing all the same kind of damages that we've been doing here on Earth, it's important to engage with these other histories. And this is what precisely we've been doing here in the exhibition. And I just want to go a little bit deeper for a few minutes into that Outer Space Treaty, which is our main treaty to regulate the governance in outer space. And I've just taken three really important preambles, sort of principles that are setting out the philosophy, the norms, the ideas around what is important in the space treaty, what do we really need. And it's also these preambles and some of that wording that is now causing a lot of debate, and where we need to take action, where we need to think a bit more progressive in order for us to protect space from further exploitation. So one of the first preamble is that space offers a really great prospect for mankind as a result of man's entry into outer space. And here we see already this very gendered idea, and obviously it's in a particular kind of era of the 60s. But a lot of space art, particularly by women, they really show very nicely how this idea of space being something for mankind is obviously very much criticized also in Nocloso's space program, where he wants to send Mata, the first girl, into space, but also something that the artists are challenging as well in a lot of the space art. Then the second really important principle is recognizing the common interest of all mankind. Again, this very gendered language that is still hanging over the space treaty. In order for the progress of the exploration and use of outer space for all peaceful purposes. And this idea of peaceful purposes is again something that is under a lot of challenge, because a lot of the technologies that we're using in our space travel do come from the military, and rockets coming from the military as well, liaised with the Second World War, the V-1s and the V-2s being really important propellers for the whole space program. So we see there's always a lot of ambiguity in the language, and we really need to deconstruct that further. And although there are some fantastic principles in the Outer Space Treaty, the moment we start to analyze it from a different historical perspective, maybe from the position of an African history, a Ghanaian history, a Zambian history, or through the lens of Mata, the space cadet of Nocloso, we start to see that there is ambiguity in the language. And what first is like this really big promise of something that is kind of enlightened in a positive sense and progressive, actually has a flip side as well. And then the third really important principle is believing that the exploration and use of outer space should be carried on for the benefit of all peoples, irrespective of the degree of their economic or scientific development. And again, here, this idea that space should be for the benefit of all peoples, we know that's not true. There's so much inequality still today. And a really good example of this is how space is already becoming very crowded with satellites, for example. And countries like Nigeria, South Africa, they're having a really starting to have a strong space program as well, wanting to launch their own satellites. Some do have already satellites, but it's becoming already quite crowded with satellites, and we see that there is already an enclosure of space, that it's not possible for every country to have their own kind of satellites. Another area where we really see where space becomes kind of crowded in a way is with space debris. So although we still see space as something that is empty, something that is available for everyone, and where it would be easy to maybe sort of transport our mining industry into space, actually it's not empty at all. First of all, we have already left a lot of debris there, but also maybe it's a view where we see space from a very human-centric perspective. And one of the things that we question as a collective of artists and academics is that we need to question also who travels to space and what's there, and that maybe we do not need to study space from a human-centric perspective, but that we also need to open it up for thinking about our entanglements with the non-humans, with the more than humans, our relationship with technology, artificial intelligence, robots, but also the rocks, extraterrestrial material. That's also life. What is life? I mean, space opens up so many existential kind of questions, and that's something that we as a collective are exploring as well, that in our new space treaty, it's maybe not just about outer space, but it's about space everywhere, because it's the entanglements of the humans, non-humans, but there is also an entanglement between Earth and the Moon and Mars, etc. And although outer space and the Outer Space Treaty is kind of presented as something that is, in a way, disentangled from our presence here, it is not. If we think about the space debris, a lot of the material, like that is used to build rockets, etc., that's been mined. And the human rights abuses that are happening in the extractive industry, they are already in space. So we really need to see these entanglements of what's happening here on Earth and in space as something that really is connected. And that's something that also is very much at the core of Bodomo's film, and why the film has been such an inspiration for all of us to explore in our own practice, either it's in our academic practice or in our artistic practice, is to show these other histories, how they are important, and that we cannot just be arrogant and tell the space travel history from our own position, our own privileged position of a Eurocentric position, but that we need to open up these other archives. And yeah, so the film, I think, really shows these entanglements really, really nicely. And also, I think the casting of Leandra Forrest, albino model, as the protagonist, as Mata, was also a very strong message for Bodomo to kind of show this idea that it's not just about humans. There is an element of, some of you may be familiar with Donna Haraway's work on the cyborg. It's also very much part of Jackie Najera's work. Dylan McGarry with his different kind of Afronauts, the Mothonauts, Elon Mollusk, really showing that we are together, you know, and that our being is not just our human being, but that there's different ways of being in the world. And some cultures are better equipped in a way to understand that our being is just in different kind of capacities, and that we may have relationships with spirits, with other cultures, etc. And that's precisely what Bodomo is exploring in her film. So that's setting the kind of background of the exhibition, and what we also, the prompts that we see in Afronauts, that we need to be more critical about who is human, what is the benefit for humankind, how are we going to protect space for peaceful purposes. These are the kind of jumping off points for us as well in our new space treaty, which Matthias is going to introduce us to. Just a few words about Matthias. So Matthias is a lecturer at the University of Edinburgh in engineering and management. Matthias works a lot on futures design. He's doing all sorts of things. He's studied also astrophysics, doing a lot on design work, future thinking, and Matthias has a few installations here in the exhibition as well, and he will talk about our future.
Thank you, Saskia. Well, welcome everybody here, and thank you for this very kind introduction, as well as the very big challenge or task ahead to talk about all our future. But we'll be quite specific because so the way that the exhibition, as Saskia said, is structured is effectively as a journey. And later on, if you haven't had the time to go through the exhibition, you can kind of follow the path through 12 stops, I think, quite symbolically, I think, so through 4 different areas, starting from over there when you enter the space, and then move through different artworks evoking different aspects of challenges we're facing in space, until you finally end up with something that's actually here. I'll just change this for, we can go, as I've built a little trick in there. So you can finally end up with the Parliament, which is where we are right now. We are in a sort of space in which we discuss and elucidate upon how different perspectives, different stakeholder views, also the ones that often remain silent, both in terms of the environment that we interact with, as well as other living things. We've mentioned sort of cats and dogs and many other animals that have ended up in space without ever really being asked, and how we treat them. Animals that we take to space accidentally through tardigrades and bacteria and all sorts of things that kind of end up in places either by design or sometimes even by chance. So the idea is that we try to create an inclusive space. It's a sort of round table. So if you go through, the final stop in this exhibition is you land in this little Parliament that I was kind of working on, and there's a little history of how Parliament as a kind of architectural structure actually evolved from a relatively simple sort of traditional forms of communities coming together, but then forms of leadership emerging, and there's kind of a bit of a separation between everyone and people who take leadership, and that broken up even further. So you have lots of these sort of parliaments in societies where there's somebody in charge and everyone else basically is told what to say and when to say it. And of course, as Saskia already referenced, at the moment, we have particular challenges with parliaments like that, or places that look like parliaments, but maybe there's not that much free speech in them. And then we have parliaments like this, which is a little bit better, I guess. There's still somebody in charge, and they're built on tension and on conflict and on kind of debate. That's not necessarily bad, but it isn't necessarily inclusive, and it does sometimes leave one or the other side to feel like they're the winner, and there's obvious challenges with that, particularly as we move further afield, and particularly if we start including more of those non-speaking participants, or at least the ones that we haven't given voice yet. And then finally we have Parliament, starting to have attempts at breaking this up, right, of bringing people back together. These are kind of, parliaments that we see in places like UN, or indeed, here in European context, the European Union, where, parliaments are representative and they're meant to be more of coming together and mutual negotiation of interests. Still imperfect, still lots of position, opposition, somebody in charge, everyone else kind of trying to kind of fight their way to become in charge. But in any case, they are kind of, from thought process, they're kind of getting there. And then finally, we have this one. And this one I'm actually going to go in and click on it because it's modeled on an image from the International Space Station where the astronauts kind of arrange themselves in a circle, floating in, of course, microgravity, which allows you to kind of sit on top of someone else's head without actually crushing them. And I think it's an interesting metaphor as to, if we are moving forward a bit more inclusively, how do we actually structure ways of conversation, discussion, engagement, that we make sure that we don't sit on anybody's head accidentally, and that we kind of account for individual views, but kind of coming together. And often in extreme environments, that's both true in the past as well as especially with space exploration, people working as teams. There are leadership roles, but there are, they're so mutually interdependent on each other that there is a different degree of respect and inclusivity when you are sort of challenged ecologically, like you are if you're trying to survive in space. So this parliament here is hopefully both visually as well as symbolically representing this kind of configuration. We have these little chairs and desks that kind of work as a collective. And of course, as I say, as we got to the parliament, now we need to make a new space treaty. So this is based on work we've done both as part of the wider context of this exhibition, as well as a mini sort of symposium we've had just after the exhibition's launch, so about a month ago, here in the same place. And we kind of started to realize that it's not just about it being a new space treaty. In fact, new space treaty implies that the old space treaty is bad. And whilst, old space treaty is obviously flawed, or it doesn't cover all the sort of challenges that are emerging, it's not to say that it just has to be ditched. As Saskia said, there's a lot of sort of principles there which are sort of helpful and are worthy goals to continue to pursue, even though the language sometimes falls short, partially due to the way people thought at the time and partially due to not foreseeing all possible eventualities that have eventually occurred. But also, the new space as a term has been kind of appropriated by a certain group of developers and businessmen, and we've mentioned Elon Musk. Actually, you should say businessmen and women, though unfortunately, most of the ones that are publicly very prominent are men. People like, if you think about new space, you think about Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Richard Branson, they're all kind of men of a particular age, of a particular bank account. So we should move beyond that. And one of the reasons why we wouldn't want to call this necessarily a new space treaty is so that it doesn't necessarily start with that particular vision of where the future of space lies. So the Old Space Treaty is based on contributions for many people in this room who very generously share their time with us, and also some things we sort of curated into this text. A couple of things super important to say. One, this is a live document. You can go and read it. It's available at parliament.gallery/all-space-treaty. So anyone can actually join in the fun. Secondly, it is actually very interactive because you can leave comments at the bottom of the page, and those comments they are moderated, so we'll have to kind of have a quick look at them just to make sure that, because this is on the web, so you know what you get. But we are very much for inclusivity, so we'll definitely let comments come through. And then, so that's kind of one part of it. The other thing just about the Old Space Treaty is that working through a couple of exercising using futures design methodology back in February, we've actually designed some sections, some draft articles, we call them. So if you go through, there's quite a bit of text. You can go and read some of these sort of inspiration. But there's a structure to the treaty. There's 4 different articles. As I said, click on that and you'll get down straight to the comments and you can add yours and read whatever's already there. There's nothing there yet, but please do add comments. And then there is the main 4 articles, main 4 dimensions we've worked out by basically working backwards from the questions we are asking of not just legal regimes, but of everyone and all of us that have an interest in space. What are we actually doing, right? That sort of stuff. So we got these 4 themes. Theme 1 is knowing space. There's some sketches that actually Saskia and I did, and then we have some great contribution by Dylan McGarry about different ways of knowing, traveling into space and exploring space. Ways that are not just physical and resonate very well with the astronauts film, and they're kind of more sort of spiritual, if you like. Then we have ecology. So it should load. It doesn't load. Okay, apologies. Actually, go straight to the ecology. I'll try and fix it. It speaks very much to the idea that how do we recognize all kind? How do we recognize entities, beings, and also non-living things that aren't humans? How do we understand their interests? How do we engage with them in a more inclusive way? And we're delighted. I mean, Saskia is going to do this in a second, but there's a very interesting contribution by Ralo here, which we're going to look at. And there's also, Donna has written a very nice text that kind of brings together architecture and sustainable systems, and how does that actually incorporate a more all-kind vision of outer space. Then we have ethics of commons. This is the idea to, okay, so now if we recognize everybody and we recognize all concerns, how do we bring those concerns together? How do we share? And we, again, delighted that we have Pippa Goldschmidt here, who will say something about this in a second, but there's also a contribution by Ellen, who's going to be talking about other things, but she's written a really nice piece about sort of where this commons idea come from in the beginning, and how it actually has evolved, and perhaps as a reflection as to, when we talk about commons, what do we actually mean? And then finally, there is space interdependencies. Again, a sketch from the workshop, but we've also got some very interesting quotes, even a little bit from me, and we're going to finish off with another film, which is going to look at those interdependencies through a community of independent astronauts, but Saskia is going to introduce all of that. So this is the structure of the treaty, but we don't believe that this is first of all, this is not a final document. As I say, it's evolving, and secondly, Saskia is a great believer in performative law. So the treaty in itself is just a bit of what we are actually trying to capture here. The rest of it is happening for the rest of this morning. So what we'll do is we're going to go through these different sections, if you like, with speakers that we have in the room, and we will end up with that kind of comment section with a panel that will include all of us plus some of our colleagues who are joining us on Zoom, and of course all of you, because that's important. I mean, the first level of inclusivity is that we bring you audience in, but then also people that are watching online through YouTube comments, etc. Right, so without much further ado, we'll start with section 1. And section 1 is knowing space. And knowing space will be introduced by, let's see if that will just work. No. Apologies, this is slightly less seamless than we would want. So there we go. Share screen. And we will go to Michelle. So I'm really delighted to be introducing as the way to think about space and knowing space, Michelle Clark, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Bayreuth University in Germany. And her research interests are many and varied, and they sort of span eco-criticism, African philosophy, and environmental ethics. And I know that she's currently working on a super interesting project about philosophy and genre, creating a textual basis for African philosophy. And I think you can kind of figure that out if you go through Michelle's amazing exhibit over there and listen to the stories that she's collected. But I'll pass you on to Michelle to give us a quick introduction to peace to all mankind, well, all kind, for the purposes of today.
Could you show me how to change the slides? Okay. So down is forward. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me to give a short talk on African science fiction and outer space. And I just want to give it, the main theme of the talk is to explore how these science fictions, as we become closer to reality, like science fiction is becoming closer to reality now, how can these fictions really ask us about our new reality? So, you know, as we are moving into space, what can these fictions tell us? How can we answer the questions that we're asking about outer space exploration? So we've come across this already, but the Outer Space Treaty reads that the exploration and use of outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, shall be carried out for the benefit and the interests of all mankind. So space travel is really presented as this exciting opportunity for technological development and extraction of resources. And it should really benefit everyone on planet Earth. And it's this quote we often hear from Star Trek, that space is this final frontier, where we have this popular imaginary of outer space. So this narrative has really shaped the Cold War space race, and it also frames this new space race, which has become quite privatized. But we can also say that space exploration can be seen as a 20th century extension of 20th century and 21st century, I should say, extension of 19th century colonization processes. So recalling colonial histories of dominant powers and New World explorers plundering lands of indigenous peoples. And those who often argue that space exploration will create a better future for all humanity and a giant leap forward for our planet, forget that space travel only includes almost one type of human, generally the white Western male, while others are left out of the space race. So it can be argued that everything from resource extraction to new space tourisms will be unequally distributed. And obviously many of you may have heard this quote that Trump kind of was saying, you know, rich guys, they love rocket ships. Okay, but what about the rest of us? And even in a lot of the space discourse, people say, you know, for example, this quote from Ted Cruz here, space is every bit as vast and promising as the frontier of the new world, which is very problematic in itself. So we need to really move away from this colonial rhetoric. So then we need new ways to imagine the future of space travel. And we need to ask ourselves, as we become space tourists, as we become settlers of other planets, as we mine other planets, what kind of future in outer space do we wish to create? And I would like to use this talk to demonstrate that contemporary writing from sub-Saharan Africa can tease out knowledge of what an ethical and inclusive future can look like. So short stories and novels from African authors are sites to imagine new future-making practices for Africa and beyond. And my research and also the exhibit looks specifically at sub-Saharan African writing in English, I should say. But there are also, of course, rich texts in other Afrophone written oral literatures, which also imagine outer space. So it's just that my own research focuses on Anglophone, and that's what the talk will focus on today. So written literature which depicts Africans traveling space goes as far back as the 1920s. So we have Lamont's South Africa and Mars from 1923. It's a satire where there's famous figures from Earth such as Shakespeare and Cecil Rhodes. They're involved in this supernatural interplanetary scheme to save South Africa from its current affairs. What I will say, if anybody does get their hand on that book, though, is that it really does contain quite colonial languages and harbours certain opinions about non-English subjects. So it's a little bit maybe contentious to read, but it's an example of very early space fiction. We also have, and there's a photo of that on the screen, this children's book by William Timlin, a South African author who wrote The Ship That Sailed to Mars, and it's got very beautiful drawings in it as well. So that's just some early examples. Then from the 1970s onwards, there was quite a flurry of African Anglophone science fiction. For example, we have a short story from Ghana by Victor Saba, who imagines an imaginary journey into the moon, and Ashun's The Adventures of Kapapa, where a scientist discovers anti-gravity. And there's several other quite popular sci-fi books as well. Kenyan writer Mailu, his James Bond-esque novel, Cardosa, imagines a romance between an alien and a secret agent. And then we also have Doris Lessing, who's a British Zimbabwean author, who has a series of interconnected novels about outer space, the first of which is Shikasta. And then one of the earliest contenders from Nigeria, Flora Napora's Journey into Space, is also a children's book, which is, again, very beautifully illustrated. There's a picture of that on the screen as well. And that imagines some school children being transported to outer space in a lift. So that's a very sweet story. So I just want to delve now into some more contemporary examples and really engage with some of the text and really show you some quotes from the fiction. My exhibit here at WUK really aimed to explore how we can rewrite the frontier of space, how these texts rewrite the frontier of space. So, for example, I've come up with kind of, for the purpose of this talk, 5 themes that these texts imagine. So that's African futures in outer space, rewriting colonial narratives, reimagining the alien other, and then earthly possibilities. What can we imagine, if we're traveling to outer space, what will the effect be on Earth? And then also, what other kinds of ethics can we explore besides Western ethics, for example? What else are these texts saying to us? So let's move to number 1, African futures in outer space. So outer space is often this site of liberation in African fiction. It's, or sometimes it's also a way of calling racial, economic, and social inequalities. And many of the texts really focus on African countries as a new world power, with Africans at the center of new futures. So, for example, Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o's Wizard of the Crow collides the biblical with the technological, as his government of the fictional Free Republic planned to build this new Tower of Babel, which readers understand in this instance as a type of space exploration. So this plan that he calls in the novel Marching to Heaven is a great triumph for his fictional republic, and it dismantles America's monopoly of space. And Ngugi further points to this deconstruction as he debates the Asian origins of the space race. As one of his characters muses, it's Marco Polo who had sojourned to the Orient, where space voyages were first imagined in folklore. He often cited as proof of the Asian origin of the space race ancient Chinese astronomers who were among the first to focus on the supernova. So Ngugi in his text really decenters the space race away from the West, away from America and away from the Soviet Union, for example. Another example of one of these texts is Deji Bryce Olukuton's After the Flare. It's set in the aftermath of a solar flare, which cripples electricity grids across Europe, Asia, and the US. So the Nigerian space program must really launch a mission to the International Space Station to prevent thousands of satellites falling to Earth. So it's really up to them to save the world. And such texts can inspire alternative ethics of space explorations and imaginative visions of the future which encourage inclusivity and collaboration. But I really also think that these texts are a way to decenter from the dominant space economy of the West. One of my favorite quotes is from Kojo Larang in his book Big Bishop Rocco and the Altar Gangsters from 2006. He's a Ghanaian author. He again speaks and critiques almost, you can read this alongside the Trump quote that I had up earlier. So the ultimate goal of the rich was outer space, but shouldn't we all have a say in the billions spent? So again, it's really trying to look at this idea of inclusivity, you know, who gets the chance to go into space and who has a say. Yeah, so that's that for this section, but what I also need to add before I go to the next slide is that there's some bad language, and there's also mention of sexual assault, so if that's disturbing or upsetting, please leave the room. It's only for 2 minutes, and also online, maybe switch off the screen if you're listening online. So just to put a bit of a warning up there, but it will literally be for a couple of minutes. So rewriting colonial narratives in outer space. So an interesting aspects of African text is this effort to rewrite colonial histories and to also avoid the mistakes and imperial violences of the past. For example, Tade Thompson's Rosewater is an example of a slow alien invasion through a fungal alien. He imagined spores infecting the earth. And this slow invasion comments on the continuing violence of empire, with one character commenting on the arrival of these aliens of, you know, what do you, we have more experience, says the character, than any Western country in dealing with first contact. What do you think we experienced when your people carved up Africa at the Berlin Conference? You arrived with a different intelligence, a different civilization, and you raped us, but we're still here. So again, this invasion of aliens and this slow violence, he's rewriting this colonial contact. And then we also have Nick Wood's short story Azania, which really looks at, you know, this idea of colonization of other planets and not rewriting, coming up with the problems that have gone before and the same violences. So it describes this moment where a spaceship is about to land on another planet because Earth has become uninhabitable. And there's a group of travelers from South Africa, and they all represent part of, you know, this rainbow nation on the ship. And they wonder, like, should we, you know, because they've also been infected by a virus, which is obviously very apt at the current moment. But they wonder, like, should they go to this new planet? What should they ethically do that, or should they say, you know, turn back? And they say, we're not going to repeat the same shit that happened to us. We're not going to do a Shell Oil or Cecil Rhodes on this place. So it's really looking very critically at what's gone before and trying to understand the future as something that has to be different. Then the third kind of concept that I want to speak about was reimagining the alien other. So we really imagine the alien as very different from ourselves, as an other. And by imagining an alien other, we create different, or we designate the alien as a category of a non-human, an entity often lacking an agency or personhood, and also external to our own ecosystem on Earth. In other words, this distinction assumes that alien life isn't our kin. And of course, there are also colonial and racial connotations to the idea of alien, which can be traced back as far as the Columbian Exchange, where explorers would encounter this unfamiliar alien culture. However, what if we are to imagine kinship in space? What if we're to imagine something else? And I want to talk about two texts now which really challenge this perception of otherness. So the first is Chigozie Fred Nwonwu's short story Masquerade Stories. And in this text, the author, who's Nigerian by the way, imagines an encounter where the protagonist of the story wonders if he's come across an alien, or is it a spirit or a masquerade? And he says, could it be that this is actually an alien and my ancestors encountered them and thought them to be spirits? I pondered. Somehow that did not sound strange to me. So this is a really interesting writing of alien contact, because we often think of alien encounters set in the future. And this story recasts this relationship to be something ancient and already part of earthly culture. So it's, you know, it's not something that we are not separate from alien because we already have alien in our culture through these spirits and masquerades. And then E.C. Asondo's text, focus group, from his collection of short stories, Alien Stories, his book's called, really says, you know, again looks at this idea of what is an alien. And he says that aliens were people like us, but they've evolved into something else. So he writes that it's only a matter of time and mankind will become alien. So I think this idea of us merging into aliens in time is an interesting concept for the ethics of space travel. An alien here becomes less about otherness, but more about the post-human or the human changing to adapt and make kin in outer space. And these texts really blur the boundary between alien life, human, and even the spiritual. So many of these texts also engage with the idea that space travel can benefit those on Earth. So, for example, Nigerians in Space, again by Deji Bryce-Lukutan, I already mentioned him with the After the Flare book. We never really leave terrestrial realms in this book. He is always imagining what it would be for Nigerians to enter into space. And he really imagines this way of the space economy to rejuvenate African economies, readdress inequalities, and create better ecological futures for the planet. And the text talks of this main character, Wale, who he imagines wanting to play drums on the moon and to squeeze out a rhythm from a talking drum into the blackness of the stars, which is very, very, I think, very beautiful in the text. And it then juxtapositions it against this idea of Americans like hitting golf balls into outer space. So again, it's this idea of inclusivity, but also looking who else can we benefit from space travel. And then Nnedi Okorafor, who's probably one of the most famous African science fiction writers. She has written a text called Lagoon, and it imagines the response of the city of Lagos as aliens land just off the coast of Nigeria in the ocean. And they merge and change the sea creatures that they find in the ocean, and then the sea creatures take revenge on the oil pipelines. So they destroy the oil pipelines in revenge for polluting their aquatic homes. And at the end of the novel, sorry, spoiler alert, an alien mist changes humanity for the better, and they overcome this dependency on oil, and they have now alien technology to create a better future for Nigeria, so it is no longer a mono economy. So texts such as these, they really imagine a future for space to lift up all of humanity rather than just one small portion, and to imagine a future where we do not need to colonize planets because Earth has become inhabitable, for example. And finally, what else can we ask of ethics in these texts? So I mentioned earlier this idea of asking ourselves what kind of future in outer space do we wish to create? And we can ask about this different type of ethics, different ways to understand outer space. And I want to discuss this last text by Christy Zinn. She's a South African writer, The Girl Who Stared at Mars. And in the text, it's really interesting because she directly refers to another way of living in space. So she says, in space, we all become alien. And yet, in space traveling between stars, the only thing we have is our humanity. Perhaps it is here that humans finally let go of their principles and embrace true Ubuntu. So for those not familiar with the term, Ubuntu is a concept which is conceived across many Southern African countries. There's lots of different names for it as well in different languages, but Ubuntu is the most widely used. And it's basically this concept that personhood is not the individual, but personhood is our relationship to each other. So the quote that gets used a lot is, I am because we are, which is opposed to the Cartesian, I think, therefore I am. So I just want to also, this is the only academic quote that I have in my text, but it's from a great scholar, South African scholar called Puleng Lenkabula, who talks about this idea of Boto, which is a similar name for Ubuntu in the Sesotho language. So she writes that Ubuntu implies at a minimum a sensible acknowledgement of the rights of others, and it also recognizes the relevance of equality, self-respect, health, opportunities, income, wealth, and relations beyond the cosmos, the planets, and creation. And so she expands Ubuntu to this beyond planet ethics, and she talks of the planet and cosmos in her in this quote. So basically, to end and sum up my talk, I think this idea of kinship, relations to offer of life, and the non-human is an important way to reframe ethics and imageries of the future, which are moving beyond extraction and imperial ways of space travel. And I really think that it's texts like these, if we really engage with them, they're a tool to imagining different futures. Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Michelle, for a wonderful talk and giving more context about different ways of knowing space through African science fiction. So we're now going to our second chapter of our All Space Treaty. And we're going to show the film by Ralo Meyer. Ralo, I don't know if you want to say something before or after the film. What do you prefer? I can give a quick introduction. So Ralo Meyer is based here in Vienna, and some of you will know Ralo very well. And Ralo works on space ecologies, and in his work he's particularly exploring ecologies of contemporary history through different kind of objects of space exploration, science fiction, of everyday life. His artistic practice is based on performative research, a processual approach of knowledge production, and employs dramatic means like scripts, rules, and props. So Ralo will be showing his film Unearthing. I think it's still a project in process, in further development. And when you enter the exhibition, you've probably seen the print screen with the word unearthing. And Ralo's work really speaks about and a continuation of this idea around these inclusive ecologies, and that we are entangled. And in the film, Ralo explores how humans and how we are already part and interact with materials which we are extracting, and also a kind of a critique against certain capitalistic extractive practices. It's always really tricky to introduce the work of the artist when when they're standing there and you kind of look for the approval. Am I doing the right thing here? So I think I'm going to leave it to Ralo to say a few more words about the film. So yeah, thanks, Ralo.
Thank you. Now, yes, so the video is actually really just in progress also. And it basically came out of a longer interest in the notion of unearthing, which I also investigated as part of this exhibition here a bit. And I think it's very much informed by ambivalence and ambiguity in a way. And so basically it comes out of my interest in the notion of unearthing, which I then followed through to a question more of how the body could be unearthed. And I think another big influence has been the pandemics and questions of physical distancing and isolation and all these things that we know all too well by now. But you'll see, and I just leave it at that now.
So thank you to Ralo for this inspiring contribution about inclusive ecology. We are now moving to the next section in the All Space Treaty, looking at the ethics of commons, and we actually have two interventions this time round. So we're starting with Pippa Goldschmidt. Pippa is an astrophysicist by training. In fact, she trained at the University of Edinburgh, where I'm based, and she then went on to work for government, including being the sole regulator of outer space in the UK for a little while, which I'm sure she'll tell you a bit about. But she's now a celebrated author, both fiction and non-fiction, working on topics inspired by science, including well received and of course quite well known collection of short stories, The Need for Better Regulation of Outer Space. And Pippa's contributed to this exhibition a couple of short stories you can read in that lovely publication that's sort of hanging from the ceiling over there, so you can go and actually read some more, but she'll read some of her contribution and perhaps make any comments about the ethics of commons.
Hi, is that better? Good, excellent. Thanks, Matt, for that lovely introduction. So I'm just going to read out the beginning of one of the short stories that's hanging in this little pamphlet over there. And if you're interested, you can go and read the rest of it. And but to start off with, I want to give a little bit of an introduction to it and the reason that I wrote the story. I usually live in Scotland. At the moment, I'm living in Frankfurt, where I moved just before Corona hit, which was really very bad timing. But most of the time I live in Scotland. I'm not from Scotland originally. I settled there, and it was my choice to move there. And I used to work in the government, where I did actually help to regulate outer space using the legal framework of the UK Outer Space Act, which is based on the Outer Space Treaty. And I did find this work fascinating, and we did worry when we did this work who had the right to launch objects into outer space and what kind of duty of care is associated with that right. And in fact, one day a group of anarchists actually held a demonstration outside our office to protest against this kind of colonialization of space, which really kind of made me worry about what I was actually doing there. So the story I'm going to read from today is called Welcome to Planet Alba. And for those of you who don't know, Alba is the Scottish Gaelic name for Scotland. And the story is set in the Scottish Highlands in the very near future. And it's based on the real-life proposal that there are going to be, I think, not just one, but maybe two proposed launch sites for rockets into outer space, based in different parts of Scotland. And the reason that these parts of Scotland have been identified as being suitable for rocket launch sites is because they're so empty. I don't know if you've ever been to the Scottish Highlands. Very beautiful. Mountains, moors, a staggeringly beautiful landscape, a very empty landscape, a very unpopulated landscape, a very underpopulated landscape. It used to be populated until about the early sort of mid-19th century. People lived everywhere in this landscape, small communities, farmers, tenant farmers who grew vegetables and tended sheep. And then they were cleared off the land in one of the sort of great sort of colonial crimes of the 19th century in what's called the Highland and also Lowland clearances. They were expelled from the land that they tended to by the landowners. And this land has never really properly been settled since, and you can see traces of where these people lived in the sort of tumbled down houses. So it's very beautiful, but if you know about the history, it's very sad. Anyway, so this story is about what might happen if there is a rocket launch site and an associated visitor center in one of these parts of the Highlands. And it's narrated by someone who isn't Scottish, who isn't Indigenous, who is also an outsider, and who may or may not have control over where he lives. So it's seen from an outsider's eyes. I'm just going to read out a couple pages. When I arrived at this place, it was a new world for me. The sun shone so much weaker than I was used to. Rocks, mountains, and the sky that was huge and so pale. I'd never been so far from home. But where was that exactly? An old question. Maybe this could be home, at least for the time being. I'd looked at it on Google Earth, of course, the first thing you do nowadays when you get offered a job the other side of the world in a place you'd never visited. What does it look like, you ask yourself, and you spy on your future home and zoom in until you hit the highest resolution, the point at which you can see offices, restaurants, cafes, apartment blocks, subway stops, civilization. There was nothing like that here. Google Earth had rendered the local vegetation in that annoying trees as broccoli way it had, but I doubted this place actually had many trees because it was too far north. Actually, there was a car park looking somewhat out of place in all that emptiness, and a square building with a flat roof. That would be the visitor centre then. A kids' playground and some sort of shed, obviously tucked away behind the visitor centre so that it wasn't visible from the car park. This was where I'd be living and working. Google Earth also showed the launch pad several kilometres north, right on the coast of this country. A metal structure, presumably the gantry, and some concrete blackened by scorch marks. It looked a fair distance away from the tourist area, and there was a narrow winding road connecting the two, but no pavements or a path. It was not somewhere you could walk to, and nothing else at all. I wondered if anyone had ever lived here before the Mars project had shown up, or if the only locals had been a flock of sheep minding their own business before the rockets arrived and barbecued them all. The first day I'd arrived and had to look at everything, including the peculiar landscape surrounding the tourist area, so much browner and less green than I expected, as well as all the latest and most up-to-date images of Mars in the visitor center, so less red than I expected, before I finally escaped, exhausted but too jet-lagged to sleep, in a partitioned-off cubicle in the shed. The others called the shed a porter cabin, a word I'd never heard before, but would hear a lot that summer. I spent some time lying on the little bed and waiting for night before it dawned on me that there was no night, because the sun barely set this far north in the summer, and there would be no more darkness than this greying of the light. Technically, the days were only separated from each other by a sort of bureaucracy of the clock, and in fact, every moment was destined to blur together with every other moment. I realized pretty soon I would have to introduce my own fake night, if nothing else than for my sanity. And so I rigged up a blanket across the porter cabin window, and that did the trick, and finally I slept. The blankets went up at 11 o'clock at night and came down at 7 o'clock the next morning, and the others laughed at me, but I didn't care. I slept. I got into a routine of waking up and folding away my blanket and making my breakfast in the kitchen, which was a microwave, a kettle, a sink, and an everlasting pile of dirty dishes, and washing in a visitor center bathroom. Management were always trying to stop us doing this, but then they were never on site, so what the hell. In the evening after work, I would go for a walk and think about how far away I was, and what I meant by far away in this context. And then I would go back to the porter cabin and rig up my blanket and sleep. Is there a word for a place that provides you with shelter, but that isn't your home? There were plenty of times where I couldn't sleep, and I would lie there watching the light eat holes through that damn blanket and trying not to listen to the others sitting around the bonfire outside telling each other drunken stories. Or even worse, trying not to listen to the two of them in the cubicle next door, making the whole porter cabin shake so much I might as well have been in there with them. In those times, I thought about whether there was a place I could return to after the summer would be over, and did that mean that the place I could return to was a place I could call home? So I'll just finish there, but if you're interested, the rest of the story is available. And it's also published by the Scottish science fiction press, Shoreline of Infinity, They do great work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pippa. I think this is a very great introduction into the idea of commons and the way that it's associated with land, but then that land is quite ambiguous as to who does it actually, not necessarily just belong to, but what does it actually mean in different contexts. So I'm delighted that next I'm introducing, yep, that works. I'm introducing Ellen Levi. No, come on, it's fine. Who is an American artist working on various aspects of augmented reality and how augmented reality actually goes into interpreting the entangled ways in which things like intellectual property regimes and other legal rights actually come about. So I'll just pass over to Ellen because she's going to show both a couple of slides as well as take you on a little tour of her artwork.
Thanks very much for that lovely introduction. Can you all hear me? Good. So the theme of science fiction has come up again and again here. Not very surprisingly, John Akamfra, the filmmaker, made a comment, and I'll paraphrase it, for those who've gone through coming from another country, ending up in America, that being in America is like being on a foreign planet. And I sometimes feel that myself. We see the experience of immigrants, we see how people are treated, and our blood gets boiling. We see the equivalent almost of alien abductions, displacements of people, contradictions, and totally inverted logic. And that's what we've had a lot of. So I'm going to start with just a little bit of background of myself. I had a commission from NASA in 1986, and it ended up being 2 months before the Challenger disaster. I was supposed to be there actually for what would have been that experience. Unfortunately, they asked me to come earlier. And I started thinking as a result of it, what are some of the unintended consequences of technology? And to give a sort of portrait of this, what I ended up doing was using images and text from the US Patent and Trademark Office of inventions related to space in this case. And in fact, the inventions that are in here are ones that NASA themselves had patented. And I was trying to express some of the twisted metal and outcome. So I continued with this. This is something I exhibited at the Field Museum in 2004 on evolution. And what I realized is that if you follow the patents, if you go from the references that are listed in the patents and follow them, it's very much like evolution, that the invention that results excuse me, is always taken from the successful part of the invention before, so it's propelled. And then, of course, you get the industries like Monsanto involved and the Terminator gene, for example. So it's actually a very grim kind of history. And as a result, I ended up bifurcating in that I would have these records that exist as data, and it was in a way like a portrait of what is it like to live in our technology. But then I started making short animations to show almost the opposite. It was like a dialogue I was having with myself. What is left out? What does this focus on capitalism and ownership leave out? I won't play this because I'm going to go over to the actual artworks. But just to give you some of a history of what I've done, this one was very involved with a 1980 important patent which became the origin of the right to patent life forms. And it came up because of the Valdez Exxon spill, the oil spill, but bacteria were modified. They were genetically altered to eat bacteria, but it did not work. But nevertheless, it set a very important precedent. So again, this is an image relying on some of the patents and text of what it might be like to live in outer space. And I've used the image of the security blanket as part of it. These are in the corner, and generally the patent itself is triggering a short animation. So that's the dialogue that I have. This was an image to try to give some sense of the actual material and matter, because I paint over the images, over the prints. This is something that shows, it's based on Diderot's encyclopedia, the images from mining. This is another, it's related to the work in the corner, and we'll go over there. Again, all of these images are taken from the US Patent and Trademark Office. Not per se, they're modified, exaggerated, and so forth. And this too, the silver foxes, I'll point your attention to, was thinking, and also the idea of having animals in space, and the entire idea of the workforce being animals put to work. But it reminded me very much of experiments that were done by a man named Belayev in Russia, where he found that he could tame silver foxes within 10 generations. They would become like dogs. They would be licking the hands of the people that fed them. And so what I propose in my own animation is just the reverse. The reverse to a kind of rewilding, which I think will go on. Just like those of us who had ancestors as we did, who came over here under dire circumstances, what are the traits they needed to be able to survive in a hard terrain? And here are some other images. A student, when I was talking about this at UCLA, made the comment that for you, space is really quite cluttered, that there's a lot of things there. And I said, absolutely, you will need all of this to survive. By the way, in thinking of science fiction, I also, it occurred to me, thinking of Kepler's first journey to the moon, what that was like, why science fiction comes up again and again. His mother was accused of witchcraft, that in his book, she was seen as riding to the moon, so that you have these very dystopian situations, and that is the origin of a lot of the science fiction. This is something a little bit different, a work I did also with augmented reality, conversations in a nuclear plant. And I was thinking of characters like Leo Szilard and others, what it might be like at this very fraught time. So at this point, what I'd like to do, I also want to make the comment that I know a number of artists now are using automation and artificial intelligence, and they're putting them into performances with robotics and AI models. also as an inquiry into alternative infrastructures, resources, and energies. Why, again, is so much of this happening now? I think part of the reason is tied up that our ideas of evolution are shifting. We're seeing this in action now. There's been a recognition of species that had not been known to exist before. And in addition, we think of evolution now much less like a tree and much more like a rhizome. So that's some of the background for my thinking in the work. So let's go over.
But as long as the screen is not. I'll share the screen again from that side. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, just give me a second. Ellen, I'll need to redo the screen. Sure. Yeah, no, don't worry. Just Zoom present and everything.
Okay, so there's renewed scientific focus on a set of experiments conducted in the 50s by Dmitry Belayev about directed evolution. He used silver foxes as his models, and in the space of 10 generations, the foxes grew long ears and licked their captors. His research raises questions about directed mammalian evolution. Can an alien terrain produce much-needed hardiness genes, Canis to vulpes, and or vulpes to Canis? And for those who don't recognize it, I'm using Joseph Boy's work with wolves as part of the images. We live within trajectories of unfettered possibilities, and then it'll start again. I won't go through all of these, but you can, if you download Art of Eve, do this yourself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellen. So.
Thank you, Ellen. That was really fascinating. And what I always find so mesmerizing when I hear you talking about your work and when I see it, it's the perfect kind of journey of my own research, because I started being interested in property when I did my PhD on intellectual property rights and how knowledge of indigenous peoples is being used in all sorts of patents. So there is a real kind of connection how I, in my own practice, started with intellectual property rights and the whole idea around how property is used and justified over so many centuries for dispossession, and that the same kind of narratives are constantly being repeated, and that we're now using the same kind of idea of dispossession and how we justify that for outer space. So in a way, our work are very much into dialogue. And just, I would like one final point to make with the connection with your artwork. So I'm currently also working with Professor David Kotamasi. We've got a research project on property rights of microbes. And at the moment, it's like a real big problem about to explode, that actually microbes will be becoming patented as well. And that has huge consequences, particularly for farmers, local farmers, small-scale farmers, actually losing any kind of sense of access to the soil. And that has huge devastating effects for food sovereignty. So again, and Chakrabarti case is a really important part of this recognition, that we can have property rights over life forms. So we're trying to develop a system where actually the life forms themselves, the microbes, become like legal personalities themselves, with their own kind of rights, so they cannot become propertized or commoditized. And that links us to the final chapter of our Old Space Treaty. And this is a very activist piece of art, and in a way, it's what we're doing here with the Old Space Treaty is a kind of relaunch in a very modest way. But from the 1995 till 2000, there was a group called the Association of Autonomous Astronauts, and they were operating across different continents, and they had different subgroups, which they called the chapters within the AAA. And Vienna was actually a really important part of this kind of activist movement. And they were very much informed by the Situationist International, and really being concerned about the labor force being part and being exploited of space exploration, and this idea that we should all be astronauts, and that being an astronaut is not just for those who are being selected, who will have had the privilege to become astronauts, but that we should all have that opportunity to become an astronaut. And I use their work and their activism as a reflection in my legal practice, to make the point that we could all become lawyers as well. And within social legal studies, we see law not just something that's in a constitution or in a treaty, but here, as a collective, we're making our own laws as well. And that's precisely what we're doing with the Old Space Treaty as well, that we all can contribute, and that it's not just the space treaty should not just be something that is being negotiated among states in the United Nations, but it's also something that we should be able to contribute to. And this is where we go kind of full circle when we see in the Outer Space Treaty, in the preamble and in the first article, that space should be for the common heritage and should belong to all of us. Then we should have a say as well how our Old Space Treaty will look like. And this is what these AAAs have been experimenting with over that 5 years. They have kind of disappeared. So it's really very difficult. They have written really interesting manifestos about the commons, property rights, and you will get a few ideas from the film, and very much around the labor force. That was a really very strong point of them. The film, the quality is kind of gives really a flavor of how films were made in '95. So it's also from an artistic perspective a really interesting film to have a look at. So that's the final chapter, and then we go into a round table discussion where we will be joined with a new crew who will join us over Zoom. And then you've all been very, very patient listening to us, and we will open the floor then for you to ask questions to the artists, and we will hopefully, we can have a debate what we're going to do with that Old Space Treaty. But first, the final chapter with the Association of Autonomous Astronauts, and it's my deep desire that we become maybe the new chapter, and that we sort of take over the baton, and we're becoming the next generation of the astronauts, the autonomous astronauts. Thank you.
What? What? Yeah, the Association of Autonomous Astronauts. Who are what? Well, we are a worldwide network of local community-based groups, all dedicated to building our own spaceships.
Seriously?
Yeah, very seriously. Well, what we want to do is destroy the present-day monopoly of space exploration, which is maintained by the government, military and corporate interests.
Uno spettro si aggira per l'universo, lo spettro dell'Associazione Astronauti Autonomi.
It starts off with two quotes which illustrate other people's ideas and mechanisms for becoming astronauts.
Here are women, and here are also female astronauts. There is Dr. Sally Kay Wright, you will see a picture of her, who on the site of NASA is called the first woman in space, which is actually not true, because as Rebecca said, the first woman in space was a Russian woman called Valentina Tereshkova.
Degli astronauti autonomi, che cos'è?
L'Associazione Astronauti Autonomi è un'organizzazione politica.
Politica, anche tu astronauta fa parte di questa associazione?
Diciamo, questo testo è un testo introduttivo che spiega un po' che cos'è l'Associazione Astronauti Autonomi, che praticamente si batte contro il monopolio posto sulle tecnologie aerospaziali dalle agenzie aerospaziali di Stato e militari, quali la NASA, l'European Space Agency, eccetera, eccetera. Un network che appunto esplora lo spazio in maniera indipendente.
Ok, e tu scrivi?
Sì.
Fai dei libri libri di fantascienza?
Sì, sono un testimonial semplicemente degli astronauti autonomi, non sono un socio.
Ma non è un po' folle questo progetto?
Sì, questo è il suo bello, insomma. Poi chissà che non ci riescano.
Un mix di tecnologia virtuale e artigianale, una babele di macchine, suoni, raggi laser, allestimenti, performance. Da questo mondo che non vede mai il sole si può andare tranquillamente sulla Luna. Lo testimoniano gli astronauti autonomi, convinti che tra qualche anno la tecnologia sarà alla portata di tutti e si potrà quindi costruire la propria capsula Apollo in cantina.
There's another kind of time. 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 There's another kind of time.
Outside the London headquarters of Lockheed Martin Corporation, a major international aerospace and arms company involved in space exploration.
AAA mission statements include these declarations. Technology is developed by the military and intelligence agencies as a means of controlling their monopoly on space exploration. Economic austerity is manufactured by the state to prevent the working class building their own spaceships. Governments are incapable of organising successful space exploration programmes. What we need today is an independent space exploration programme, one that is not restricted by military, scientific or corporate interests. An independent space exploration programme represents the struggle for emancipatory applications of technology.
Well, we've declared an information war on all government space agencies based on the kind of recklessness that they display in space. For example, a good example of this is the Cassini probe, which NASA have sent up into space, and it contains on board about 33 kilos of plutonium. If this probe actually enters the Earth's atmosphere, which could happen, the result could be potentially catastrophic. So it's an example of the kind of single-minded recklessness of a government organisation which is really only interested in furthering its own interests and its own agenda. It's by extension, a kind of global New World Order agenda. In many ways, that New World Order is relocating itself in space.
Check. Anyone? Beep. Beep. Beep.
So that's when I joined the association at the time of that.
No sign of it whatsoever. We've lost it in the sky. It's just got too small and too hard to see. Cannot pick it up anymore. It's travelling in a northeast direction.
Information is becoming a strategic resource that may prove as valuable and influential in the post-industrial era as capital and labor have been in the industrial age.
Global finance.
Cyber warfare.
Information age.
World Information Org is a transnational cultural intelligence provider, a collaborative effort of artists, of cultural workers, of scientists, of technicians.
Technology is never neutral. It is charged, it has a political status.
Then there is the real dynamic of European distrust of the United States and the use of its intelligence services, a distrust that also reflects itself at Britain. And I think as more is investigated, that is shown to be a correct distrust.
It's because one of the things that I think is interesting about worldinfo.org is the idea of activism and artists, that sort of division being blurred a little bit.
Commercial and military exploitation of space.
There's another kind of time, my love. Realities are social. Realities are social. Outer space. Outer space.
Okay, thank you. So this was the final chapter of what we would like to re-envisage as an all-space treaty. So we would like now to open the floor for questions, and hopefully we had some trouble getting some of our colleagues on Zoom whilst we're trying to connect them. So I invite all the artists. I don't know, Ralo, if you want to maybe put your chair there, or so you can join us. And to take questions from anyone in the audience, I will sort of go around with the microphone. So anyone having a question?
First of all, thank you so much for a really amazing series of topics. And I appreciate all the work so far. I have kind of a technical question, because I feel like now listening, I'm missing so much information for myself, like to really be able to participate in the idea of an all-space treaty or a new space treaty. So one question I have, in case someone has knowledge, legally speaking, what are the requirements to go into space as an individual or as a collective? Because I'm thinking of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, and actually I don't know what's required of them. Is it the equivalent of them as corporations going into space? Does it have to do with money, or do they have some other legal status? And could that status also be obtained by a collective, for example? So this is kind of where my question is coming from. And even I don't understand if Jeff Bezos going into space, for example, is the equivalent of the United States going into space. Because of that, I have no idea. So anybody who has knowledge, I would love to hear about it.
Great question. And in the meantime, our colleagues, and I have arrived as well. Kai Uwe, welcome in our exhibition. I don't know if we've got Jackie already. I don't think so. So I can try to answer your question, but Kai Uwe is the expert on anything to do with law and governance of outer space. So he will correct me if I'm making incredible big errors here. But this is sort of part of the ambiguity we have with the Outer Space Treaty, making the point, sorry, I will stand here, then it's more comfortable to see me. It makes the point that we cannot extend our jurisdiction and national sovereignty into space. But at the same time, any object or astronaut that goes into space falls under the responsibility of a country. They need to approve for any object or collective or astronaut to go into outer space. So in that sense, that national sovereignty actually still does matter. And that's something that a lot of corporations probably may want to see some changes there, that they may get more autonomy over it. And but this is something that Kai Uwe will have a much better view on it. But I sense the way how there is pressure coming from these big corporations is that they would, like always with corporations, they would like to have a sense of control, and they feel in order for them to make the investments worthwhile, they want to have this idea to get property rights over the resources, etc., etc. So we see that we at a really interesting junction here, that there is this pressure on how far we're going to go with that national sovereignty. On the one hand, we don't want it to be extended into outer space. On the other hand, that may be a really important control to make sure that corporations will not take over. And we see that within the kind of recent developments. So whilst initially this idea that the governance of outer space should be done through a treaty under the United Nations, now we have actually national laws being passed to allow mining and ownership in outer space, so in the US and Luxembourg, for example. So there is a lot of ambiguity and a lot of questions and tensions, and that's the big kind of question for the future, is who is going to have that responsibility for these astronauts and the objects, etc. And so far, that still lies with the countries where they still have a responsibility. If you launch under the American responsibility, they are responsible. So Kai-Uwe, how many mistakes have I made here?
So
I think we can hear you.
Hear me?
Yes, you're with us, yes. Oh, we don't have the sound now. Sorry.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Oh, no, the moment we hear you for 1 second and then it disappears.
Oh.
Try again, please. Oh, no, it's
wrong.
Sorry, we've lost you. We just hear like a microsecond of your wonderful voice and then you disappear again. In the meantime, I'm also delighted to introduce you to, Jackie Najera and she's the amazing artist, Kenyan artist, who made the works that you may have seen on a lot of the flyers and also in the metro station. Are we trying again to see if we can get Kai-Uwe? No. Sorry? I did introduce him. So, Kai-Uwe Schorg is a professor in international relations and governance. He's also sitting at the European Space Agency. Maybe whilst we're waiting, was that answering your question?
I'm just realizing how little I know. So it's more of like an open question to all of the people who have information in the room. Yeah, thank you. And your answer did help, actually. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, of course.
So when I worked on this in the British government, there is a British piece of legislation called the Outer Space Act, which transposes the Outer Space Treaty into British law, and that gives the British government responsibility for anything launched into space by a British entity, which means that if you are a British individual or a company, you have to come to the British government for a license in order to get permission to launch something into outer space. And there's a process by which the government will assess you, which is essentially what I did quite a long time ago. So, and that process looks at the sort of environmental impact of what you are trying to do, say building like a rocket launch site, and it also looks at the environmental impact of the thing you're trying to do in outer space too, say if you are causing damage. So there is a sort of framework on which we can build, and that framework, at least in Britain, has been around for a long time, but not all country has that type of framework.
You also need to register any object that you want to launch, but not every object is actually registered. Any other questions whilst we're trying to see if we can get any sound? Any other questions from the audience? Yeah?
So we have these cheap flag countries, right? Ships sailing under Liberian flag. So I was just wondering, and of course now we have Luxembourg being talked up as a main space-faring nation. So pardon me for being really stupid. I'm just wondering if that's going to be the case, that we're going to have these really small countries somehow providing the flag for these operations for things or entities, companies from somewhere else. Is that likely to happen? Thank you. what's the dystopian future going to look like in that scenario?
Maybe a science fiction writer, maybe well positioned to to think about that dystopian future.
I think that's a really interesting point. And again, we have seen that in the past. There are companies, there is a movable rocket launch site called Sea Launch. That was incorporated, so it's a boat effectively from which you can launch rockets, and that was incorporated under Panama law. So it's exactly the same sort of analogy. And Luxembourg has its own space law because it wants to encourage companies to come and incorporate in Luxembourg, and in return it gives them the rights to hold on to the resources that they can mine from outer space. So yeah, I think it's a really important question. It's not a stupid question at all. I think we will see that increasingly happen.
But obviously, a lot of inequality will come into that as well. Some countries being able to lobby for that, and others not. We still have no sound, and yeah, they have a great time amongst themselves, probably making jokes about us. Yeah, another question here. Okay.
Not really a question, but maybe an answer to your question as well. So we're talking about nations with rocket launch capability or orbital launch capability. There are still hundreds of countries without that launch capability, such as my country of the Philippines. And the way we launch satellites now is we piggyback on Japanese, American, and Middle Eastern rocket launches. And so the Kyushu Tech University in Japan actually made what they call a BIRDS program to help small countries launch their first satellites. So we launched our first nano satellites along, I think, with Malaysia and Brunei all together. And so we can see like these bigger corporations or governments trying to help smaller countries without launch capability get to space in a way that may be a little easier for them, especially because we don't have rockets in our own countries. So I just wanted to share that.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you for that. Any other questions from the audience? No? I've got a few questions, maybe for the panel. A very simple, basic question that I've been thinking a lot about, and not sure if I have an answer for myself, and it would be great to hear from the panel, is why do we want to go, and is it something that do we really need it, and if so, why do we think we need to travel to space? So it's a really big open question, but I think it would be great to hear your thoughts about it. Michelle, would you like to start?
It's a good question. I always wonder this myself. I think, should we go into space? But I think when I'm reading the types of fiction that I read and I research, it's a way to redefine our humanity, and I think that that's really important. So it's how, again, like this idea of how we relate to other, what's a post-planetary ethics look like, can also redefine ethics on Earth, I think. And also in terms of like the ecological, so we have this idea of like the other as, you know, this ecological other as well. I think that traveling into space should really also redefine that, so we don't have this duality of the non-human and the human. And I really think that these sorts of engagements with art and science fiction really reestablishes or like disrupts this notion of this binary. And I think that really imagines a better future in that sense.
Hello? Do you want to? No, I don't think. I don't think it's solved yet by the looks of it. Ellen?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. I've been immersed in a book recently by Dunn, A Natural History of the Future, and he makes a very compelling case that all species eventually die out, and probably ours will. I think that the time for space exploration to see if this is a possibility really is just to keep people going. His conclusion is that nature will survive, but we will not necessarily.
Does anyone of the audience have a view on should we go, why we go? Yeah?
I was just thinking, for me it's not so much a question, should we go? I think if humanity doesn't kill ourselves, it's more like if history has proven something that things will happen in a way, even very differently than we imagined. So I still think it's a good idea to imagine it in emancipatory and maybe good ways, whatever that could be, and in diverse ways. And so I think it's more of in this direction. I myself, I don't think should we not. I'm pretty sure better it will happen in one another way.
And it's worth maybe mentioning the work of James Schwartz. He's a philosopher on anything to do with outer space travel. He's based in the US, and his work is really interesting. He's making the point, he wrote a book about it, that going to space is something that it's happening, and it's not something that we can prevent, but that we need to think about the ethics, and it sort of relates to Michelle's work. And he sees a lot of parallels with the Antarctic Treaty, that we need to preserve outer space for scientific purposes, and in that sense, that we need to maybe regulate that better, that we preserve that space for specific kind of explorations, and not necessarily go there for an unbridled further extraction of resources, but more for the sciences. And there is still so much to discover there. And if we would have like tourism that would increase, we may do a lot of damage. So it's opening up that wider debate as well. What's out there, and what do we consider as live, and space being presented as something that is empty, and that we can just go there and make claims, and that language that was used during colonial times kind of being extended into outer space. James Schwartz really making the point, we need to be careful about that, but at the same time that there may be a useful exercise around the sciences. Pippa, you wanted to add something?
Yes. Yeah. So from an astronomical point of view, we're discovering hundreds of planets that's supporting life. So I think this kind of narrative of us venturing out into the universe as explorers to have to be sort of complicated by the fact that we are going to be encountering other types of life and recognizing them and recognizing their rights. And increasingly, I think it's not going to be us as humans going to space. It's going to either be our machines that do so, or some kind of adaptation of humans.
Thank you. So a thumbs up that we may have sound. Kai-Uwe, I'm sorry to ask you again if you would be able to maybe share some of your thoughts at the earlier question. Who can go? How do we regulate that?
You can.
For 1 second, we heard you. No, it's still disappearing. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Jackie, can we maybe try, maybe just crossing my fingers that maybe. Can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you. Yes, hello. Welcome, and thank you for all your patience.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. And Jackie is calling in from the East Coast in America, so still really very early. So yeah, thank you so much for being here. We would love to hear more about your work, and maybe you can just say a bit more about the two works we have here in the exhibition, Story and the Three Wise Men, and if you can just, yeah, maybe tell a little bit about your arts practice and how you sort of got into the Maasai series and what's been driving you in your work.
So
Oh, I'm sorry, Jackie, we're also losing you now. The moment there is more than one sentence being said, we lose the connection. I'm so sorry. We give it one more try to see if we can sort it. I've got another, is there any other question from the audience? I've got another question. Something else that I find interesting to explore in my own work is how, by thinking about outer space and how we're going to think about a governance, somehow, because it allows us, I think, to have that kind of utopianism.
From the room.
Sometimes it allows us to think more freely. And I was just wondering from the panel if you have the same kind of feeling that outer space can be a really productive environment to think about our own practices here on Earth, just because it feels like it's a whole new area. We can be more speculative, we can be more transgressive, progressive in our thinking in outer space. Is there anything that we can learn from thinking through outer space on our practices here on Earth? Any one of the panel wanting to comment on that? You're thinking. For me, in my own work, it definitely does. Like I think this idea around, in my own work around property, that's definitely something. By putting it in that kind of extreme environment, it's sort of, you go into a dialogue. And I think it goes really back to these very basic questions around the ethics of property. Why do we think we can do that? And for me, outer space really gives me that platform to go back to these really sort of authentic, almost existential kind of questions. Ellen, maybe because it's...
It occurs to me, do we have a Larry Lessig for outer space now? Who would those people be? That's a question, Saskia. Maybe you have an answer.
Sorry, can you?
The question is, who is the equivalent of Larry Lessig in terms of the governance of, what is that? The Commons. I mean, he's the expert for the U.S., at least, in the Commons.
Yeah, a really interesting question, Ellen, and it's again where I sort of start to put the dots together in my own work. So having started my journey into property by having had the incredible luck to work with hunter-gatherers and seeing how for them property is not about rights, but it's about responsibility, it's about custodianship, it's about looking after each other, and it's that deeper kind of relationship and making kin, not just with their own species, but being in a sort of very ethical relationship in a wider context. And I find thinking about outer space and the meaning of the commons and all of that, what I find interesting in my work is that I can allow some of that thinking to merge with thinking about the future and how we need to do things differently. And sadly, if you look into the Outer Space Treaty, if you look into some space lawyers, not all of them, often they fall back on these old traditions, how we thought about property, and not thinking in a different way. And this is why this exhibition is all about asking questions, how can we be different in the world? And I think for us to something different around property and governance in outer space. First of all, I think we need to do a lot of de-learning ourselves and open our minds to other ways of being in this world. And this is where I think I can, in my own practice, learn a lot from the work I've been doing with other societies.
I think that there's one other aspect that has not really been discussed, and that is space as a repository, an archive, because I do know a number of scientists, thinking of the late Robert Shapiro, who with other scientists was very much involved with ideas of how information could be reduced in size and even genetically and then sent to preserve the species' memory.
Yeah, and for me, in my own work, I think the whole notion of science and what is knowledge is again a question that we need to open up more widely, and like indigenous peoples, for example, they will make comments sort of saying, what's the big deal? There's a beautiful story of an indigenous scholar sort of saying, I don't understand why you're so obsessed about the Apollo program and the first man on the moon, because we've been going there every day for thousands of years. And I think it's these kind of interactions and dialogues opens up for me interesting questions. Why do we see only particular kind of technologies as technology and particular kind of science? And it's also what Jackie Najeri is really exploring in her work as well, with the three elders, for example. The traditional Maasai blanket for her is like a spacesuit. And why do we think about a spacesuit as the white NASA type of spacesuit? And for her, it's that blanket, that traditional blanket. Your kente cloth, you know, could also be a piece of technology, could be an astronaut suit. And yeah, I think these sort of dialogues are really important and not happening enough. Michelle, you wanted to come in?
Just on a similar note, the project that I'm involved in at the University of Bayreuth, we're looking at philosophy and genre. So we want to really redefine what philosophy is. So it's not just some thinker, you know, some far-off thinker who says, like, this is the category that I'm thinking about and I'm going to write, you know, some kind of necessarily, I'm going to define these things. And instead, philosophy can also be through text. So, you know, I'm using this idea of sci-fi as philosophy. It's a method, but also philosophy as a methodology. So this idea that we can really redefine and also redefine philosophy and redefine text to say something about the world around us, but also be more inclusive in that aspect. So it's not just coming from like a top-down, but you know, a bottom-up approach as well. So it's a community, and it's a dialogue rather than just philosophy being, you know, a far-off aspect, like, you know, as the moon is a far-off aspect. So I think that's like to a lot of, like, I think researchers who are, and I think the same with the artists that I've been working with on this project, like it's really fascinating to see our practices be this collaborative philosophy, I think. And then philosophy is not just, it's more than just thinking, it's also an action as well. So it's an activism, yeah.
Does anyone from the audience want to comment further on this, or another question? No? I have another one, maybe for the panel. Do you think that outer space can also be a place of hope? I could give you a few minutes to think about. Pippa?
Yeah, I mean, the one example that kind of immediately springs to mind for me was the launch of the James Webb Space Telescope on Christmas Day. And for me, that symbolized sort of quite working on. But so this wonderful sort of collective imagining of work that we will be able to do in the future, and the ability to put a space telescope 1.5 million kilometers from Earth. It really, especially with all the other bad news, it really kind of symbolized for me something positive and something that will be happening in the future too, I promise.
Ralo, yeah, you also want to have a comment here?
I throw in an opposite opinion. I don't know, like with the current political situation, I think it has also shown that there's a certain kind of, from my side, from my point of view, a certain kind of naivety that space will erase all these conflicts and we're gonna all collaborate and nations gonna collaborate in space. Because I don't know, I think it took 5 days now that international collaborations with the Russian Space Agency has been cancelled. There have been kind of a lot of verbal escalation going on, at least in the space station. So I don't know. I think it's always put kind of as the front that this is a space. Space is a space where we can collaborate and where we can all come together. But as soon as shit hits the fan, it's the same there.
I find it incredible that it has been going as a the International Space Station has been going for decades, and astronauts have been collaborating there, sort of regardless of where they come from. So it's still, I think it's, I mean, there have obviously been a lot of problems over just recently, but this is a long-term prospect. This is a long-term, truly global collaboration. So I do see hope in the future for this type of work out there as opposed to here.
Yes, I would not, yes. But my point is just that I think it's often been put that space would be a different space, but it's the same, like, there's no difference. I mean, the Apollo-Soyuz exchange would not have been possible if not earthly developments allowed for it. Same, the ISS would have not been possible without changes in the Soviet Union and the consequent collapse of the Soviet Union. I think it's much more. I'm just speaking against that. This would be kind of a paradise where we all love each other or something. So, and I think the current situation shows that it really, like, if we can talk on Earth, why should they be able to talk on the ISS?
Talking about hope, I'm going to call on all the ancestors to see if we can actually now hear Jackie. Shall we give it a final try?
Can you hear me?
So far, yeah. Can you try? Oh.
Produce my work.
We hear you for 1 microsecond and then you're disappearing again, Jackie. I'm so sorry that the connection is not working. Anyone of the audience having any further thoughts of if space could be a place of hope? Yeah, great.
Have there been any developments with like civilization in space? Like, has it gotten to that point yet, or is it just kind of a more theoretical thing that people want to go to space? Or, yeah, I don't know if you understand my question.
You happy to take the question, Michelle?
The only, I don't know too much, I'm not a space expert technology-wise, but I know that they are really exploring, obviously, the possibility of colonization of Mars, which is why they're sending the space probes there. And so it's all underway. So I don't think it will obviously take a long time, but I think like even the psychological experiments are happening to see like with people, like, can we cope for being on our own for a long time? And there's all this talk of like, what will we meet when we get there? And so the technology is it seems very far away, but I think like even when we think of something like data-driven technologies like AI, those are coming quickly, and I think it's, even with space exploration, maybe it's going to be further in the future, but I think it's not too far that we will end up being on different planets and things. That's my personal understanding. That I don't know, but maybe someone else will know.
Pippa, what do you think as a scientist?
Maybe, she said knowledgeably. So I think there are still major technological drawbacks to getting people to somewhere like Mars, and the trip is, it's an order of magnitude more difficult than getting to the moon. And speaking of which, we haven't been to the moon for like nearly 50 years. So in a sense, we've kind of forgotten how to do that. We have to relearn that technology. And then Mars is a difference between a 3-day trip to the moon and a 6-month trip. And the rigors of that space trip is still, I don't think that there are enough answers yet as to how we can overcome them. There's a lot of interesting psychological work, like you were saying, Michelle, particularly at the University of Edinburgh. There's a scientist called Charles Cockell, who is an astrobiologist, and he also looks at issues around freedom and liberty of space colonies, and how you can set up a space colony that imagines how people can live freely, and what kind of restraints they will live under. So effectively, will we be sending people to live in a prison or not? And even more interestingly, he's done work on this with prisoners in Scotland. He has done research to encourage them to imagine what it might be like to live on Mars. And I think there are 2 or 3 volumes of research that he's published with other researchers that's really worth checking out.
And there is a new volume coming out very soon. I'm conscious of time. It's 1 o'clock, and you think you've all been doing amazingly well to sustain listening energy levels. So I think we're going to draw it to a close. And thank you so much all for being here. And thank you to the amazing panel, to the artist. Also, huge, huge thank you to the WUC team. Massive, massive thanks. Before you go, maybe as a start of kind of reclaiming the moon, there is an artwork from Dylan McGarry on the other side of that wall, where you can actually rename places on the moon. The idea is that this moon will travel around the world. Hopefully I will take it with me when I go to Namibia, where we're going to do field work. So it would be lovely to have renaming practices here in this space. And also please do log on to the website, the Parliament, add your comments, feedback. We would really appreciate it. Thank you so much for being here and for all that sustained energy. And yeah, thank you so much.